I know what you all did." The words escaped my lips before I could stop them, cutting through the mahogany-paneled silence of Whitmore and Associates like a blade through silk. Every head in that sterile conference room turned toward me with the slow, synchronized precision of vultures sensing fresh carrion. My siblings, if I could still call them that, stared at me with expressions ranging from feigned confusion to barely concealed panic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the moment my world crumbled, when I learned that 26 years of family meant absolutely nothing. My name is Cordelia Ashworth, and 3 hours ago I discovered I don't exist. Not legally, anyway. Not in the eyes of the woman who raised me, loved me, taught me to braid my hair and balance a checkbook and believe that blood runs thicker than water. The woman whose funeral I'd just attended 2 days prior, whose casket I'd helped carry, whose grave I'd wept over until my mascara ran in black rivulets down my cheeks like ink staining parchment. Grandmother Vivienne Ashworth had been the matriarch of our family for as long as I could remember. Even at 93, she'd commanded respect and fear in equal measure, her silver hair always perfectly coiffed in that vintage style that spoke of old Hollywood glamour, her spine straighter than most people half her age. She was old money, the kind that didn't just talk, but whispered, and when it whispered, entire industries listened with bated breath. The Ashworth estate sprawled across 200 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, complete with a main house that looked like something out of a Gothic novel, stables that housed horses worth more than most people's homes, and enough family secrets buried in the gardens to fertilize the rose bushes for decades. Growing up there had been like living in a fairy tale, albeit one where the fairy godmother wore Chanel, and the magic wand was a platinum American Express card with no spending limit. I should have known something was wrong when my siblings arrived at the lawyer's office in a pack, like wolves preparing for a hunt. Julian, the eldest at 32, had always been the golden boy. Harvard MBA, perfectly pressed Armani suits that cost more than my monthly rent in California, and the kind of smile that could convince investors to hand over their firstborn children along with their portfolios. He sat at the head of the mahogany conference table like he already owned it, his manicured fingers drumming against the wood with barely contained anticipation. There was something different about him today, an energy that buzzed beneath his usually controlled exterior like electricity waiting to arc. Beside him sat Octavia, 29 and sharp as a stiletto in her funeral black Armani dress that probably cost more than my car. She'd inherited grandmother's cheekbones and ruthless business acumen, turning her trust fund into a small empire of boutique hotels across Europe before she was 25. Her green eyes, the same shade as mine, or so I'd always thought, kept darting toward the door like she expected someone else to walk in, someone who might upset whatever plan they'd clearly orchestrated. Then there was Maximilian, the baby at 24, though calling him a baby was like calling a shark a goldfish. He'd been grandmother's obvious favorite, the one who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. His trust fund had already been partially released to fund his art gallery in Soho, which we all knew was really just an expensive way to launder money from his less savory investments in cryptocurrency and God knows what else. They sat there in their expensive clothes and inherited confidence, chatting quietly among themselves in those cultured tones that came from years of private schools and finishing classes, while I took the seat at the far end of the table like some kind of afterthought. Nobody had saved me a spot closer to the front. Nobody had asked about my red-eye flight from California, where I'd been working as a marine biologist for the past 4 years, studying coral reef restoration in the Pacific. Nobody had even made eye contact when I walked in wearing my only black dress, a simple Target number that suddenly felt like sackcloth in a room full of designer funeral attire. I should have seen the writing on the wall then, but grief has a way of making you blind to everything except your own pain. I was still raw from grandmother's death, still feeling the phantom weight of her hand in mine during those final hours when her breathing had become so shallow I'd had to lean close to make sure she was still with us. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to echo off the oil paintings of long-dead lawyers that lined the walls like stern judges. He was older than time itself, with wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his watery blue eyes and hands that shook slightly as he opened the leather portfolio containing grandmother's last will and testament. He'd been the Ashworth family attorney for over 40 years, had probably drafted wills for half of Connecticut's old money families, and had seen enough family drama to write a dozen soap operas. "Thank you all for coming," he began in a voice that sounded like autumn leaves being crushed underfoot, dry and rustling with age. "I know this is a difficult time, but Vivienne was very specific about her wishes regarding the reading of her will. She wanted the family gathered together, and she wanted certain things said." He looked directly at me then, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the aggressive air conditioning that seemed designed to preserve both documents and emotions in a state of frozen suspension. "Before we begin with the formal reading," Mr. Whitmore continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone about to detonate a bomb, "I have a letter that Mrs. Ashworth specifically requested be read aloud first. She said it would provide context." The envelope he withdrew from the portfolio was cream-colored and thick, the kind of expensive stationery that grandmother had always insisted upon for important correspondence. It was sealed with red wax, grandmother's personal seal, a raven perched on a thorny branch, which had always seemed ominous, but now felt downright prophetic. My heart began to race as he cracked the seal with the reverent care of an archaeologist opening an ancient tomb, unfolding the letter with movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed. "To my beloved family," he began reading in grandmother's words, though his voice couldn't capture the steel that had always underlined her vowels, the iron core that had made her both feared and respected in equal measure. "If you are hearing this, then I am finally free of the burden I have carried for 26 years. 26 years, my age exactly. The chill in my spine spread outward like frost on a window pane, each word dropping the temperature in the room by several degrees. "I have lived with a secret that has eaten away at my soul like acid on metal," Mr. Whitmore continued, and I noticed how Julian's drumming had stopped completely, how Octavia's breathing had become shallow and rapid, how Maximilian's usual smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "A secret that 3 of my grandchildren have known and kept, believing that their silence would be rewarded with gold and property and all the trappings of Ashworth wealth." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with the force of a sledgehammer against my chest. 3 of my grandchildren. 3, not 4. The math was simple and devastating. But silence, as I have learned in my 93 years on this earth, is just another form of betrayal. Perhaps the cruelest form, because it masquerades as loyalty while slowly poisoning everything it touches. Mr. Whitmore's voice seemed to be coming from very far away now, as if I were underwater and he were speaking from the surface, the words reaching me distorted and strange. The mahogany walls felt like they were closing in, the oil paintings seeming to lean forward in their frames, their painted eyes following my every movement with the patient attention of predators watching wounded prey. "Cordelia," he continued reading, and hearing my name in grandmother's words should have been comforting, should have felt like an embrace from beyond the grave, but somehow it felt like a death knell. "My dear, sweet Cordelia, you have lived 26 years believing you were an Ashworth, and in every way that matters, in your heart, in your spirit, in your soul. You are. You have the heart of an Ashworth, the spirit of an Ashworth, the stubborn pride that has both blessed and cursed our family for 7 generations. I could feel my siblings watching me like hawks circling a field mouse, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. My eyes were fixed on Mr. Whitmore's lips, watching them form words that were systematically destroying everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, my entire existence. "But you are not, by blood, an Ashworth at all." The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like war drums. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock was ticking, counting down the seconds until my old life officially ended and whatever came next began. The sound seemed to grow louder and louder until it filled my entire world. 26 years ago, Mr. Whitmore continued, and each word felt like another nail in the coffin of my identity. Your mother, my daughter Alina, arrived at my door in the middle of a November storm, pregnant and terrified. She had fallen in love with a man she couldn't have, a man whose name I swore never to reveal, not even to you, when you were born on that cold December. However, and that one word felt like a door slamming shut, like the sound of a judge's gavel ending a trial. They were persistent. Over the years, they painted a picture of you as ungrateful, distant, more concerned with your career than your family. They told me you complained about family obligations, that you rolled your eyes during family dinners, that you were just waiting for me to die so you could claim your inheritance and disappear back to California forever. Lies. Every single word of it was lies, and they knew it. I had never complained about family obligations. Hell, I'd flown cross-country at least 6 times a year just to attend Ashworth family functions, spending money I could barely afford on plane tickets and hotel rooms. I'd given up job opportunities, turned down research grants, declined dates and social invitations because family comes first, Cordelia. Family is all we really have in this world. But apparently, my siblings had been busy rewriting that scripture to suit their needs, turning my dedication into ingratitude, my love into manipulation. They showed me photographs taken at family gatherings where you looked tired or distracted, the letter continued, and they spun stories about your expressions, your body language, your supposed disrespect. They brought me edited recordings of phone conversations where your voice sounded flat or disinterested, though I later learned these had been carefully spliced together from longer conversations. They'd been collecting evidence against me. For years, they'd been building a case, gathering ammunition to use in their war against my existence. Every family photo, every phone call, every interaction had been scrutinized for signs of my unworthiness. I began to wonder, and this was the part that truly broke my heart, if perhaps blood did matter more than I thought. If perhaps you really didn't belong with us after all. The doubt they planted grew like a cancer, eating away at my certainty, making me question my own judgment about the girl I had raised from infancy. Each word was a knife twist, and I could feel myself bleeding out emotionally right there in that sterile conference room. The grandmother who had raised me, who had taught me everything I knew about strength and dignity and never backing down from a fight, had been slowly convinced that I was ungrateful, that I didn't deserve to be called an Ashworth. So I decided to test you all, Mr. Whitmore read, and suddenly his voice took on a different tone, one that reminded me suddenly and sharply of grandmother herself when she was about to deliver a particularly devastating piece of wisdom. I decided to discover, once and for all, what each of you was truly made of. The atmosphere in the room shifted, and I could feel my siblings starting to squirm in their expensive chairs like children caught in a lie. I changed my will 6 months ago, he continued reading, removing you entirely from the inheritance, Cordelia. And then I told Julian, Octavia, and Maximilian exactly what I had done. I told them that they had succeeded, that you would inherit nothing, that they would split everything between them. The house, the property, the investments, the art collection, even my jewelry. Do you know what they did with that information, my dear girl? I was afraid to breathe, afraid that if I moved at all, this moment would shatter, and I'd wake up from what had to be the worst nightmare of my life. They celebrated. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, acrid and choking. Julian's face had gone pale as parchment. Octavia was staring at her hands like they held the secrets of the universe, and Maximilian looked like he might actually be sick all over Mr. Whitmore's antique Persian rug. Julian opened a bottle of Dom Perignon that had been meant for your wedding day, the one I'd been saving since you turned 18, the letter continued, and each detail was like salt in an open wound. Octavia called her banker to discuss investment strategies for her increased inheritance, already planning to liquidate some of the art collection to fund her hotel expansion. Maximilian started designing plans for a bigger gallery, one that would cement his place in New York society once and for all. I could picture it so clearly it felt like watching a movie, the 3 of them toasting my downfall in grandmother's formal dining room, the crystal champagne flutes catching the light from the chandelier I'd helped her clean every spring for 20 years. Already spending money that had been mine since birth, making plans for a future that didn't include me, dividing up the spoils of their successful campaign. They never once asked if you knew about the change, Mr. Whitmore read on. They never expressed concern for how you might feel, never wondered if perhaps they should prepare you gently for the shock. They simply celebrated, and then they began making plans to have you removed from the family permanently. Removed from the family. The words hit me like a physical slap. They hadn't just wanted my inheritance. They'd wanted me gone entirely, erased from the Ashworth legacy as completely as if I'd never existed at all. But you, Cordelia, the letter went on, and grandmother's love seemed to reach out from beyond the grave to wrap around me like a warm embrace. You never changed. Even though you believed you would inherit nothing, you still flew across the country to be with me in my final weeks. You still took a leave of absence from your research position, still slept in that uncomfortable hospital chair beside my bed, still held my hand when the pain medication wasn't enough and the fear crept in. That was true. I'd spent grandmother's last month with her, reading aloud from marine biology journals that I knew bored her to tears, but made my eyes light up like stars. I described my research into coral reef restoration, painted pictures with words of the underwater worlds I studied, shared my passion for ocean conservation, even though I knew she would have preferred gossip about eligible bachelors or my non-existent social life. You read to me about sea anemones and kelp forests and the mating habits of seahorses, the letter continued, and I could almost hear grandmother's laugh in the words. And even though I complained about how dull it all was, I treasured every moment. Because you were sharing your world with me, the world you'd built for yourself through intelligence and dedication and sheer force of will. I'd never once asked about the will during those final weeks. The thought hadn't even occurred to me. I'd been focused entirely on making sure grandmother wasn't afraid, wasn't alone, wasn't in pain. I'd advocated with doctors and nurses, researched treatment options, held her hand through the difficult nights when sleep wouldn't come. You proved to me, Mr. Whitmore continued reading, that love is not about blood or money or what you can get from someone. Love is about what you give freely, without expectation of return. You, my darling girl, love like an Ashworth should, completely, unconditionally, and without reservation. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I barely noticed them. The betrayal was morphing into something else, a burning rage that started in my stomach and spread outward like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Which is why, and here Mr. Whitmore's voice took on the tone of someone delivering a final, irrevocable verdict, I am leaving everything to you. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the blood rushing through my siblings' veins as the reality of their situation began to sink in, could feel the shock radiating from them like heat from a furnace. The house, the property, the investments, the art collection, the horses, the jewelry, everything goes to Cordelia Ashworth, who has earned the name through love rather than accident of birth, the letter continued. Julian, Octavia, and Maximilian will each receive exactly what they deserve for their years of loyalty and devotion. Mr. Whitmore reached into the portfolio again and withdrew 3 smaller envelopes, each sealed with the same red wax that had marked grandmother's letter. $1 each, along with a personal note explaining my decision in detail. Julian erupted first, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking like ice on a spring pond. This is impossible, he shouted, rising from his chair so quickly that it fell backward with a crash that seemed to echo off the walls. She's not even really family. This will can be contested. We have grounds. There are laws about this sort of thing. Actually, Mr. Whitmore interrupted with the patient tone of someone who had been practicing law longer than Julian had been alive. You don't have any grounds at all. This will was witnessed by 3 independent parties, none of whom are beneficiaries. Mrs. Ashworth was of sound mind and body when she dictated it to me personally just 3 months ago. She also included a very specific clause, stating that any attempt to contest the will would result in the immediate donation of the entire estate to the Marine Conservation Foundation. I almost laughed despite everything. Even from beyond the grave, grandmother was still 3 steps ahead of everyone else, still anticipating every move and countermove like the chess master she'd always been. Octavia was the next to lose her composure, her mask of sophisticated indifference finally slipping to reveal the viper underneath. You manipulative old bitch, she snarled, though whether she was talking about grandmother or me wasn't entirely clear. Her perfectly applied makeup was starting to smudge, and her voice cracked with genuine panic. You think you're so fucking clever, but we all know the truth. You're nothing but a bastard who got lucky, a charity case who should be grateful we even acknowledged your existence. That's when something inside me finally snapped. I stood up slowly, carefully, like a predator preparing to strike. My legs felt shaky, but my voice when I spoke was calm and level, though every word was razor-sharp and designed to cut deep. You want to know what I think is clever, Octavia? I said, finally looking directly at my siblings for the first time since entering the room. What I think is truly, genuinely clever is spending 10 years convincing an elderly woman that her granddaughter, because that's what I am, blood or no blood, was ungrateful and selfish and undeserving of her love. I took a step toward them, and all three actually flinched backward like I was brandishing a weapon, instead of simply speaking the truth. What I think shows real genius, I continued, is manipulating someone you claim to love into doubting her own judgment about a person she'd raised from infancy. What I think is absolutely brilliant is celebrating the disinheritance of someone who loved you unconditionally, someone who would have shared anything she had with you without a moment's hesitation. Julian found his voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. You don't understand the complexities of... Oh, I understand perfectly. I cut him off, and the steel in my voice would have made grandmother proud. I understand that you're all exactly the kind of people she always warned me about. The kind who see family as nothing more than a bank account with legs, who measure love in dollars and cents, who think loyalty is something that can be bought and sold like stocks or bonds. I walked around the table slowly, deliberately, letting my words sink in with each measured step. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. But here's what you failed to understand about grandmother, I said, now standing directly behind Julian's overturned chair. She was always smarter than all of us combined. Did you really think she wouldn't see through your pathetic little campaign? Did you honestly believe that a woman who built a financial empire from nothing, who survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars and countless economic upheavals, wouldn't recognize manipulation when it was happening right under her nose? Maximilian, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke up, his voice thin and reedy with barely contained panic. So what happens now, cousin? The way he said the word made it sound like a curse, like something dirty he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. You get everything and we get nothing. Is that your idea of justice? I smiled then, and it felt like the first genuine emotion I'd experienced since walking into that room. It was a smile with teeth in it, the kind grandmother herself might have worn when closing a particularly satisfying business deal. Oh, Max, I said, using the childhood nickname I knew he despised, the one that made him sound like a golden retriever instead of the sophisticated art dealer he pretended to be. You don't get nothing. That would be far too generous. You get exactly what you gave grandmother in her final years, which is to say, nothing of value. You get what you deserved based on your actions, your choices, your character. I turned to address all three of them, letting my gaze move from face to face, memorizing their expressions of shock and rage and dawning comprehension. You get the knowledge that you spent 10 years trying to steal from someone who would have given you anything you asked for, I said. You get to live with the fact that the woman who raised us all, who loved us all, died knowing exactly what kind of people you really are underneath all that designer clothing and inherited privilege. The rage was still there, burning bright and hot in my chest, but it was tempered now by something else, a sense of purpose that felt as solid as bedrock, as unshakable as the foundation of the house where I'd grown up. You know what I'm going to do with this inheritance? I asked, though it wasn't really a question. I'm going to turn part of the estate into a marine research facility, the Vivienne Ashworth Center for Ocean Conservation. It'll provide grants for young scientists, fund research into coral reef restoration, and educate the public about marine ecosystem preservation. Julian's face twisted with something that might have been grief or might have been greed. With him, it had always been impossible to tell the difference. You're just going to throw away centuries of family history for fucking fish. You're going to turn our ancestral home into some kind of aquatic theme park." "No," I said quietly, and my voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm going to honor it. I'm going to do something that actually matters, something that will make a real difference in the world long after we're all dead and buried. Something grandmother would have been genuinely proud of, instead of just pretending to be proud while secretly wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake." I looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces one last time, because I knew with crystal clarity that I would never see them again. Not at family gatherings that would no longer exist, not at holidays that had been poisoned by their betrayal, not at any future occasion where their presence might contaminate the new life I was going to build. "You see, the difference between us isn't blood," I said, and these were the words I'd been searching for since Mr. Whitmore first cracked that wax seal. "It's character. It's the choice to love someone without conditions, to be loyal without expecting rewards, to do the right thing even when no one is watching. You three failed that test so completely, so spectacularly, that you actually made it easy for grandmother to see who you really were." I walked back to my seat and sat down, folding my hands in my lap exactly the way grandmother had taught me when I was 6 years old and learning proper posture for tea parties. "Mr. Whitmore," I said, "what do I need to do to finalize this inheritance and ensure that it can never be challenged or taken away?" The answer, it turned out, was remarkably simple. Grandmother had been thorough in her preparations, anticipating every possible legal challenge and closing every loophole. For the next 2 hours, we went through paperwork while my former siblings sat in stunned silence, their faces cycling through various stages of grief, rage, and disbelief as the reality of their situation sank in. They signed their dollar acknowledgments with shaking hands, their signatures looking like the scrawled last words of dying men. When it was finally over, when every document had been notarized and filed and officially recorded, they gathered their things and prepared to leave. Julian turned back at the door, his face a mask of cold fury that would have terrified the person I'd been that morning. "This isn't over, Cordelia," he said, and his voice carried a threat that seemed to echo off the walls. "Family doesn't end because of money. We'll be watching you. We'll be waiting for you to fail, to prove that you never deserved any of this." But I wasn't the same person who had walked into that room 3 hours earlier, expecting to hear how the family fortune would be divided. I was someone harder, stronger, tempered by betrayal but not broken by it. I was someone who had been tested by fire and emerged as something new and unbreakable. "Oh, Julian," I said, smiling that same genuine smile from earlier, the one that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "It was over the moment you decided that love was something that could be bought and sold, that family was just another business transaction. You just never realized it until now." As I drove away from the lawyer's office that afternoon, the Connecticut countryside blurring past my windows like an impressionist painting, I thought about what grandmother had said in her letter about tests and character, and the difference between blood and family. In marine biology, we study symbiotic relationships, the ways different species can live together for mutual benefit, supporting each other's survival and growth. But we also study parasitic relationships, where one organism feeds off another, taking everything it can while giving nothing back. I had spent 26 years believing I was part of a symbiotic family system. Now I understood that for my siblings, I had always been nothing more than a host organism, something to be used and eventually discarded when I was no longer useful. But parasites, I reflected as the familiar landscape,